It's like, what is a woman?
Well,
Can you tell me what a woman is?
no, I can't.
It seems to me that the conversation about womanhood and what is a woman, and Matt Walsh's conversation with the trans activists, and just the internet's kind of gone crazy on it, and the conversation is still continuing, which is a good thing. It's not a fad, maybe. It's not one of these trending things that happens overnight and is gone. But it's been, 2 weeks, and the conversation's continuing. That's a good thing. I want to take time in this video to address a number of things. Those things are a bit of a philosophical nature, and they're going to help us in our understanding of how we define things, how those things are not relative, and how they can help us and aid us in our understanding of what a human is, what a man is, what a woman is, especially what a woman is, and give us some clarity, hopefully. So we're going to look at some clips. We're going to look at some clips from the interview and the conversation with Matt Walsh on the Dr. Phil show. We're actually also going to look at an interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson, where he's asked a very similar question. Do you know what a woman is?
Well,
Can you tell me what a woman is?
no, I can't.
The reason why some of these people are refusing to, or actually don't think you can define a woman, is because they actually think the definitions are completely arbitrary and made up. So here's a very basic distinction we need to make. Those things that are discovered and those things that are made up. To them, the concept of a woman or womanhood is an arbitrarily made up concept or term, something we communicate solely based on subjective feelings and ideas. And I would say at the root of this entire conversation is this problem. One side, me included in that side, thinks that the truth of what a woman is or gender or what a man is not just arbitrarily made up. It's not made up on subjective feelings, but it is discovered. So the definition we give to it is a definition that is discovered within nature rather than invented by us. And I think that's actually at the root of this disagreement and conversation. Here's Dr. Jordan Peterson being asked a very similar question. And his response, I think, is very telling. And if we observe it carefully as to some of the questions he asked, it's going to help us in our explanation of the situation.
Do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. I don't know what that means. What do you mean a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, it depends what you think a real woman is, but do you think a trans woman is a woman?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition, and I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense, because what do you mean by real?
Well,
Jordan Peterson is uneasy with this question. He actually says he doesn't like the question, partly because it's not a very clear question. See, the questioner actually is assuming what I was just talking about, that the definition to what a woman is arbitrary, because she says it's in your head. Whatever you conceive of whatever a woman is that what a trans woman is? And Jordan Peterson is actually operating from a completely different understanding of what a woman is, right? And so he uses biological markers, right? And approaches it from a physical kind of standpoint and says, well, those individuals can't do these things, and therefore we shouldn't qualify them as women. He goes on to say, well, what do you mean by real? Because you just said, is a trans woman a real woman? And I think maybe that's more of philosophical and psychoanalytic kind of stuff he wants to find out, like what makes something real and doesn't. It's sort of interesting that the interviewer kind of says, well, whatever you conceive of as a woman, whatever that thing is, do you think a trans woman is that? Well, it's like, what if my conception of a woman is completely different than whatever you want to define as a woman? Like, there has to be some kind of an objectively defined, okay, agreed upon, we could say, term where we can say, this is that. Here's what A is, and we're talking about B. Is B actually A, or is B something else? C. Let's check out Matt Walsh's interview, in which one of the activists is actually trying to define a woman, but says they cannot define a woman because they don't identify as a woman. This is sort of silly when it comes to logical thinking or thinking just properly, because it's essentially saying if you are not a thing, you can't have an opinion about the thing or you can't speak about that thing, right? And this is generally used, by the way, in like pro-abortion, anti-abortion kind of conversations. Like, you're a man. You can't have an opinion on abortion because you're a man, right? By the way, that would kind of not work anymore because one could just identify as a woman and talk about it all they want. It's sort of silly because then you can't talk about anything that you're not. So you can't talk about racism because you're not the race in question that is being, say, oppressed, right? You can't talk about what it's like being a little kid because you are not a kid at the moment when you're making those comments and having that conversation. It just doesn't fly because truth is not actually completely subjective to your experiences. That's pretty obvious and clear. But this individual seems to be arguing from that kind of a perspective. Since you are not a thing, you can't actually say what a thing is. But what about when we have women who identify as women who are saying trans women aren't women because they have a very strict definition of what a woman is? Then this individual has very serious problems.
I have answered the question. You stood up here and said trans women are women.
Yes.
Tell me what you mean. What is a woman?
Womanhood is something that, just as Ethan explained, I cannot define because I am not
But
myself.
you used the word. So what did you mean when you said trans women are women if you don't know what it means?
Right? So here's the thing. So I do not define what a woman is because I do not identify as a woman. Womanhood is something that is an umbrella term. It includes people
That describes what?
people who identify as a woman.
Identify as what?
As a woman.
What is that?
Was to each their own. Each woman, each man, each person is going to have a different relation with their own gender identity and define it differently.
That doesn't-
and so
I'm not
trans
asking for
women are women too.
Okay, with that said, let's jump into our actual philosophical conversation here. How can philosophy and how can logic specifically help us in having this dialogue properly? Other than the fact that definitions in logic have rules, and if we want to have proper conversations and know what we're talking about, we got to follow those rules. And if you're interested in what those rules are, click on this video, go watch that, and then come back and watch this. What we're going to be talking about is this. Within philosophy, we have this concept or concepts, right? And it's been around since Aristotle. And the idea is this, that when we talk about an object, any object, we are talking about its essence, right? What we call essential properties. So there are properties that make that thing it. Its essence is what the thing is, by the way. And then what the other category is what we call accidental properties. Accidental properties are the sort of things that can change, and that thing remains being it. For example, if we were to define the essence of a pen as a writing instrument that uses ink, anything that is beyond that, say ink is not used, say it's not a writing instrument, then it no longer could be defined as a pen. That would be, or those things would be, essential properties to a pen, right? The penness of the thing. Accidental properties are the sorts of things that can change and the pen remains a pen. For example, the color of the ink, the size of the pen, the material the pen is made of. It might be made of wood, it might be made of metal, it might be made of plastic, whatever it may be. Those are accidental properties. So we have essential properties and accidental properties. So when we come to this conversation about humanity, specifically what is a woman, now this is a lot more complicated, by the way. The questions we're asking about essential properties and not accidental properties, right? For example, long hair and eyelashes and beards are not essential properties. Whether you have those things or you don't, you could either be male or female. So essential properties is what we're talking about. Now, the way that Matt Walsh and Jordan Peterson looked at this issue has to do with genetic makeup and has to do with procreation, right? Is that generally speaking, unless there's something wrong actually, all women can have babies. And we'll address the subject of what about some women who cannot have children. Right? And on the conversation with Dr. Phil, Matt Walsh has actually asked this question.
Your definition is that a woman is someone who is female, you said, right?
Correct.
Gotcha.
Is a biological female.
So what happens if we have maybe someone who is female, identifies as a woman, right? You know, cisgender woman, right? As you just explained, but maybe doesn't have the ability to reproduce. Maybe doesn't have those organs that you're talking about that are reproductive organs.
This question actually is not very complicated because there are all sorts of things that we could say are essential to human beings, but certain human beings can't access or don't function. For example, eyesight is something that all human beings have. It's kind of a part of our humanness, right? The faculty of sight. We have eyes, we see. But then there are people who are blind. Well, that does not stop them from being human, right? You could talk about the physical makeup of a male or a female. And suppose this female, this woman, goes into war and loses their limbs and they come back without any limbs. That does not make them less human. Okay? Because even though they don't have access to those attributes or properties, that does not mean they are not that thing. And the reason for that is because we're talking about something that's out of the norm. If everything worked properly and normally, then that would be the case. And when that's not the case, we say, well, something's kind of broken, right? So if I get poked in the eye and I go blind in one eye, something has gone wrong. Something is broken at that time and moment. So this is not a very complicated question to respond to. It's fairly simple just to say, well, they don't have the functions that normally they would have if everything was okay. But that does not equate someone who would not have that function, say childbearing, if things were completely okay. As a matter of fact, things are completely okay and they cannot bear any children, or their genetic makeup is a bit different. What is also interesting about this subject is that there seems to me that there's an underlying assumption that there's a difference between the physical body of the person and then the non-physical body of the person, where the non-physical body of the person is in the wrong physical body of the person, which assumes something like a soul, right? And if it assumes something like a soul, then it assumes something like an immaterial world that actually exists, like some sort of a dualist model of a world that exists, which sort of begs the question about God. And if it is the case that we have souls and then there's a God, then there's actually an intended way on God wanting us to function and live, and there's a created order, and there's an end goal, like a telos. And so this whole conversation about subjectively feeling and deciding to be a certain gender completely falls apart, because God doesn't arbitrarily do things. No God would be able to do things arbitrarily, unless you believe in a very limited kind of God. But in the monotheistic traditions, if you conceptualize God in that kind of a sense, everything's going to have to be ordered. Morality is properly functioning. And I don't think these people that are voicing these opinions have actually seriously thought about this issue. Right. Now, you might say, well, Arthur, you're being a bit offensive. You know, they must have thought about it. It's their life and so on and so forth. I'm not so convinced about that. Right. I'm not very convinced that they've sat there and thought about the moral implications. They've thought about the spiritual assumptions and connotations that these things might have. I think they've been encouraged a certain way. They believe these things genuinely. I don't doubt that they believe it genuinely or sincerely, but I don't think they've looked at the matter fully. So hopefully this has helped you a little bit in your thinking and how you process this information. And I hope it's actually been helpful as to the next time you sit across someone and you have this conversation, that you're able to bring up some of these subjects about accidental properties and essential properties, give some examples, and be able to try to figure out what are the essential properties of what a woman is and what are the accidental properties to what a woman is, and be able to answer the question once and for all. Thank you for watching. God bless you guys. I will see you guys next time.